In a world where kindness often goes unnoticed, an 8-year-old girl's innocent decision to share her sandwich with a homeless man sets in motion an extraordinary chain of events that will shake an entire community to its core. What begins as Hannah Brown's simple act of compassion unveils a mystery spanning wealth, tragedy, and lost identity, proving that sometimes the smallest hands can unravel life's biggest puzzles. As the truth behind the homeless man's identity emerges, Hannah and her mother Sarah find themselves at the heart of a story that transforms not only their lives, but ignites a movement that will challenge everything their community believes about the power of reaching out to strangers. The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees in Central Park, scattering golden leaves across the worn wooden bench where Peter sat hunched over, his weathered coat pulled tight against the chill. His eyes, though tired, held a distant gleam of something that seemed lost to time itself. 8-year-old Hannah Brown skipped along the familiar path home from Jefferson Elementary, her bright purple backpack bouncing with each step. Her mother, Sarah, always told her to come straight home after school, but something about the man on the bench caught her attention. Unlike the other park regulars she passed each day, the elderly couples feeding pigeons or young mothers pushing strollers, this man sat completely still, staring at his worn shoes. Hannah slowed her pace, clutching her lunch bag. She hadn't finished her sandwich at lunch because Jessica Thompson had shared her birthday cupcakes with the class. The sandwich was still fresh, peanut butter and strawberry jam, cut diagonally just the way she liked it. "Are you okay, mister?" Hannah's clear voice carried across the short distance between them. Peter looked up, startled by the small voice addressing him. His eyes met Hannah's warm brown ones, filled with genuine concern. For a moment, he seemed unsure how to respond, as if human interaction had become foreign to him. I'm fine, little one," he managed, his voice rough from disuse. Hannah took a step closer, her head tilted slightly. "You don't look fine. You look hungry." Without hesitation, she opened her lunch bag and pulled out the sandwich. "Would you like my sandwich? It's peanut butter and jelly." Peter's eyes widened, a mix of surprise and emotion crossing his weathered features. I couldn't take your food, child." "It's okay," Hannah smiled, already unwrapping the sandwich. "My mama always says sharing is caring. And I already had birthday cupcakes at lunch today." With trembling hands, Peter accepted the sandwich half she offered. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice catching. I can't remember the last time I ate something proper." Hannah sat down on the bench beside him, maintaining a polite distance but close enough to chat. She watched as Peter took a small, careful bite, then another, larger one as his hunger took over. "I'm Hannah," she announced proudly. "I'm in 3rd grade at Jefferson Elementary. What's your name?" "Peter," he replied after swallowing. "Just Peter." Something flickered across his face. Confusion, perhaps, or uncertainty, but it passed quickly. "Do you live near the park, Peter?" Hannah asked innocently. Peter glanced at his worn backpack leaning against the bench. "I stay around here," he said carefully. "The park is peaceful." As they sat together, Peter slowly eating the sandwich, Hannah chatted about her day at school, her favorite subjects, art and reading, and how her mother was teaching her to braid her own hair. Peter listened intently, occasionally nodding or offering a small smile. "Sometimes," Peter said suddenly, interrupting Hannah's story about her class pet hamster, "I remember different parks, with fountains and statues, but it's all fuzzy." He touched his temple gently, his brow furrowing, like trying to remember a dream. Hannah leaned forward, intrigued. "What kind of statues?" "Angels, I think, and a woman holding something." Peter's voice trailed off, his eyes growing distant. "But I can't. It's gone now." The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows across the park. Hannah knew she should head home. Her mother would be worried. "I have to go now," she said, standing up and adjusting her backpack. "But maybe I'll see you tomorrow. I walk this way every day after school." Peter looked at her with grateful eyes. "You're very kind, Hannah. Thank you for the sandwich." As Hannah turned to leave, Peter reached into his coat pocket, almost unconsciously, and pulled out a gold ring. He turned it over in his hands, studying it as if trying to recall something important. Hannah caught a glimpse of it glinting in the late afternoon sun. "That's a pretty ring," she commented. Peter looked at it as if seeing it for the first time. Yes, it is. Someone important gave it to me, I think. But I can't remember who." He quickly tucked it back into his pocket, his hands trembling slightly. Hannah waved goodbye and hurried home, her mind full of questions about the mysterious man in the park. When she arrived at their modest apartment, her mother was already home from her shift at the hospital, preparing dinner. "Hannah Brown, you're late," Sarah said, her voice stern but loving. "I was getting worried." "I'm sorry, Mama," Hannah replied, setting her backpack down. "I was talking to someone in the park." Sarah turned from the stove, her nurse's instincts immediately alert. "Talking to whom?" "A man named Peter. He was hungry, so I gave him my sandwich," Hannah explained, her voice full of innocence. "He has sad eyes, Mama, but he was nice. He has a pretty gold ring, but he can't remember who gave it to him." Sarah's expression shifted from concern to a complex mix of emotions: worry for her daughter's safety, pride in her kindness, and curiosity about this mysterious man. "Baby, while it's wonderful that you want to help others, we need to talk about being careful with strangers," Sarah said, pulling Hannah close. "Even kind-seeming ones." Hannah nodded, but her mind was already wandering back to Peter and his mysterious ring. Something about his sad eyes and fragmented memories tugged at her heart. As she helped her mother set the table for dinner, she decided that tomorrow she would pack an extra sandwich, just in case Peter was still there. What Hannah couldn't know was that her simple act of kindness that day had set in motion a chain of events that would change not only Peter's life but the lives of countless others in their community. Sometimes the smallest gestures of compassion can ripple outward in ways we never expect, touching lives we never knew we could reach. The next few days brought a new routine to Hannah's after-school walks. Each afternoon, she would find Peter on the same bench, his tired eyes lighting up at her approach. Her mother's words about stranger danger echoed in her mind, but something about Peter's gentle demeanor made her feel safe. "I brought extra today," Hannah announced on a particularly crisp Thursday afternoon, pulling out 2 sandwiches from her lunch bag. "Mama helped me make them this morning. There's turkey and cheese, and apple slices too." Peter accepted the food with grateful hands that trembled less than they had days before. "You and your mother are too kind, Hannah." He paused, a distant look crossing his face. "I remember, someone used to make sandwiches like these for me, with the crusts cut off." "Who was it?" Hannah asked eagerly, settling onto her usual spot on the bench. Peter's forehead creased with effort. "A woman, with silver hair. She smelled like lavender, I think." He shook his head slowly. "But it's like trying to catch smoke with your hands. The memory just slips away." Over the next hour, Hannah shared stories about her day, how she'd gotten an A on her spelling test, and how Tommy Martinez had brought his pet turtle for show and tell. Peter listened attentively, occasionally offering small smiles that made the wrinkles around his eyes crinkle. "I used to travel," Peter said suddenly, interrupting Hannah's story about recess. "I remember paintings, big ones, in buildings with high ceilings and marble floors." Hannah's eyes widened. "Like museums?" "Yes, museums." Peter's face brightened. "I would stand for hours, looking at the brush strokes, the colors." His hands moved through the air, as if painting invisible masterpieces. There was one painting of water lilies, so large it felt like you could swim in it. "Did you paint too?" Hannah asked, fascinated by this glimpse into Peter's past. I think I did." He reached into his worn backpack and pulled out a small sketchbook, its pages wrinkled and worn. Inside were delicate pencil drawings, cityscapes, faces, and flowers, though many pages were torn or water-damaged. Meanwhile, at home, Sarah Brown was growing increasingly concerned about her daughter's new friend. While preparing dinner one evening, she noticed Hannah carefully making an extra sandwich for the next day. "Baby," Sarah said gently, "we need to talk about your friend in the park." Hannah looked up from her sandwich making. "Peter's nice, Mama. He tells me stories about art and traveling. Did you know he used to paint? And he's been to Paris." Sarah sat down at their small kitchen table. "Honey, I know you have a big heart, just like your daddy did, but we don't know anything about this man. It's not safe for a little girl to spend so much time with a stranger." "But he's not a stranger anymore," Hannah protested. "He's my friend, and he's lost, Mama. Not just homeless, but lost in his head too. He can't remember things right." Sarah's nurse's training kicked in. Memory loss could be a sign of various conditions, trauma, injury, mental health issues. While her heart ached for the man's situation, her maternal instincts screamed caution. The next day, Sarah decided to leave work early. Standing at a distance, she watched as Hannah sat with a man in weathered clothes, his gray-streaked hair neat despite his circumstances. What struck her most was how he maintained a respectful distance from Hannah while they talked, his body language non-threatening. Back on the park bench, Hannah was learning more about Peter's mysterious past. "The ring," Peter said, holding the gold band in his palm. "Sometimes I dream about it." A woman was crying, happy tears, I think. She was wearing one just like it. His voice grew frustrated. "Why can't I remember?" "Maybe it was your wife?" Hannah suggested. Peter's hand closed around the ring. No, I don't think so. It was someone else. Someone important." He tucked the ring away, his hands shaking slightly. "There was a garden too, with roses. White ones. In a big house with columns." Hannah was about to ask more when she heard a familiar voice. "Hannah, baby, it's time to go home." Sarah stood a few feet away, her nurse's scrubs visible under her coat. Her expression was cautious, but not unkind as she looked at Peter. Peter immediately stood, maintaining a respectful distance. "Mrs. Brown, I presume. Your daughter has been very kind to me. I apologize if I've caused any concern." Something in his refined speech, despite his appearance, caught Sarah's attention. This wasn't a typical homeless person. There was an education, a history behind those confused eyes. "Mama," Hannah said, "Peter was just telling me about the ring his family member gave him and about the paintings he used to make." Sarah studied Peter more closely, noting his dignified bearing despite his circumstances. "Do you have any family we could contact for you, Peter?" Peter's face clouded with frustration. I should. There are faces in my dreams, voices I almost recognize, but it's all scattered, like pieces of a puzzle I can't put together." He touched his temple gently. "There was an accident, I think. Everything before that is shadows." Sarah's medical training made her even more curious. Retrograde amnesia? Head trauma? But before she could ask more questions, Peter gathered his few belongings. "I should go," he said quietly. "Thank you, Hannah, for your kindness. And Mrs. Brown, you've raised a remarkable daughter." As they watched Peter walk away, Hannah tugged at her mother's sleeve. "See, Mama? He needs help. He's lost more than just his home. He's lost himself." Sarah wrapped an arm around her daughter's shoulders, her heart torn between caution and compassion. What she didn't know was that the mystery of Peter's identity was about to unravel in ways none of them could have anticipated. That night, as Hannah slept, Sarah sat at her computer, researching missing persons cases involving amnesia. Something about Peter's story, his mannerisms, and that gold ring nagged at her mind. Little did she know, she was about to stumble upon a truth that would change all their lives forever. The sharp knock on their apartment door came just as Sarah was helping Hannah with her homework. It was early evening, and the autumn sun had already set, casting long shadows through their modest living room windows. Sarah wasn't expecting visitors, especially not at this hour. Through the peephole, she saw two people in police uniforms, a tall woman with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, and a younger male officer with kind eyes. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she opened the door. "Mrs. Sarah Brown?" the female officer asked, showing her badge. "I'm Detective Maria Rodriguez, and this is Officer James Chen. We'd like to speak with you and your daughter about someone you've been in contact with at Central Park." Sarah's protective instincts immediately kicked in. "Hannah, sweetie, why don't you go to your room for a minute?" "Actually," Detective Rodriguez said gently, "we'd like to speak with Hannah too, if that's okay. She might have some important information that could help someone." After settling on their worn but comfortable couch, with Hannah pressed close to her mother's side, the officers began their explanation. "We understand you've been interacting with a homeless man who goes by the name Peter," Officer Chin started, his voice gentle. He pulled out a photograph and placed it on the coffee table. "Does this man look familiar?" The photo showed a well-dressed man with neatly trimmed hair, standing in front of a modern art gallery. He wore an expensive suit and had a warm smile that reached his eyes. Despite the stark differences in appearance, Hannah gasped. "That's Peter," she exclaimed. "But he looks different." Detective Rodriguez nodded. "This photograph is of Andrew Collins, taken approximately 18 months ago. He's been missing for over a year." Sarah leaned forward, studying the photo more closely. "Andrew Collins? The name sounds familiar." "It should," Officer Chin explained. "The Collins family is well known in the art world. They own several galleries across the country and run one of the largest art restoration foundations in North America." Detective Rodriguez pulled out a file. "Mr. Collins disappeared after a serious accident. He was driving home from his mother's 60th birthday celebration when a drunk driver hit his car. The other driver fled the scene. When emergency services arrived, Mr. Collins was conscious but disoriented. He was taken to Metropolitan Hospital with a severe concussion and other injuries." "But that's where I work," Sarah interrupted, her nursing background clicking into place. "I remember hearing about a wealthy patient who wandered off, but I was working in a different ward at the time." "Yes," the detective continued. "Mr. Collins left the hospital before completing his treatment. Security cameras showed him walking out in his hospital gown, seemingly confused. Despite extensive searches, private investigators, and a substantial reward, no one had been able to locate him until now." Hannah, who had been listening intently, spoke up. "Is that why Mr. Collins can't remember things properly? Because of the accident?" Officer Chun smiled kindly at Hannah. "That's right. The doctors believe he suffered from what's called retrograde amnesia due to the head trauma. Combined with the confusion and shock from the accident, he lost most of his memories of who he was." "The ring," Hannah suddenly exclaimed. "He always carries a gold ring in his pocket. He said someone important gave it to him, but he couldn't remember who." Detective Rodriguez's eyes lit up. "That would be his mother's ring. Grace Collins gave it to him the night of her birthday party, just before the accident. It's a family heirloom that belonged to his grandmother." Sarah ran her hands through her hair, processing the information. "So all this time, Hannah's been bringing sandwiches to one of the wealthiest art collectors in the country? Your daughter's kindness may have just solved one of our most puzzling missing persons cases," Detective Rodriguez said warmly. The Collins family had almost lost hope of finding him alive. "What happens now?" Hannah asked, her voice small and worried. "Will Mr. Collins, be okay?" Officer Chun leaned forward. "We have a team ready to approach him tomorrow, along with a medical professional and his mother, Grace Collins. We were hoping you both might be willing to help. Having familiar faces present could make the situation less stressful for him. His mother has been briefed about your daughter's role in finding him," Detective Rodriguez added. "She's extremely grateful and would like to meet you both." Sarah pulled Hannah close, feeling her daughter tremble slightly. "Of course we'll help, but please understand, to Hannah, he's not Andrew Collins, the wealthy heir. He's just Peter, her friend from the park who needed kindness." "That's exactly why we need your help," Detective Rodriguez smiled. "Your daughter's simple act of kindness did what all our resources and investigations couldn't. It gave a lost man a connection to hold on to." As the officers prepared to leave, they provided details for the next day's meeting. Hannah tugged at Officer Chin's sleeve before he reached the door. "Will Peter remember who he is when he sees his mom?" she asked anxiously. The officer knelt down to her level. "Recovery from amnesia is complicated, Hannah, but seeing familiar faces and being in familiar environments can help trigger memories. Your friendship with him may have already started that process without you knowing it." After the officers left, Sarah and Hannah sat in silence for a moment, processing the evening's revelations. Finally, Hannah spoke, her voice thoughtful. "Mama, even if Peter turns out to be a rich man named Andrew, can we still be his friends?" Sarah hugged her daughter tightly, marveling at how a child's simple compassion could bridge such vast divides. "Of course, baby. True friendship doesn't care about who someone is or what they have. You taught me that." That night, as Hannah lay in bed, she thought about Peter/Andrew and his family, wondering what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know it yet, but her small act of sharing a sandwich would soon spark changes that would reach far beyond just reuniting a lost man with his family. The morning dawned crisp and clear, with golden sunlight filtering through the autumn leaves in Central Park. Hannah clutched her mother's hand tightly as they approached Peter's usual bench, accompanied by Detective Rodriguez and a small group of people waiting discreetly nearby. Among them stood an elegant woman in her early 60s, her silver hair styled perfectly, and her posture regal despite her obvious nervous energy. Grace Collins twisted her hands together, wearing a ring identical to the one Peter carried in his pocket. "Remember," Detective Rodriguez whispered, "let Hannah approach him first, as usual. We don't want to overwhelm him." Hannah walked toward the bench where Peter sat, his familiar weathered coat wrapped around him. "Good morning, Peter," she said softly. He looked up, smiling at her voice, but his expression changed as he noticed the group standing at a distance. "Hannah? What's happening?" Before Hannah could answer, Grace Collins gasped audibly. Even from a distance, seeing her son in such a state, thin, weathered, confused, was overwhelming. The sound caught Peter's attention, and he turned toward it. Something flickered in his eyes as he looked at Grace. His hand unconsciously moved to his pocket, where the ring lay hidden. I know you," he whispered, though he didn't sound certain. Grace stepped forward slowly, tears streaming down her face. "Andrew," she said softly, "my dear boy." Peter/Andrew stood up, swaying slightly. "That perfume," he murmured. "Lavender. I remember, lavender." Hannah watched as Peter's face transformed with recognition and confusion. "The woman with silver hair," he said, looking at Hannah. "The one who made sandwiches with the crusts cut off. It was your mother," Hannah finished gently. Grace moved closer, pulling out her own ring. "You have one just like this, don't you, Andrew? I gave it to you on my birthday last year. Grandmother's ring." Peter's trembling hands withdrew the matching ring from his pocket. As he held it next to Grace's, memories began flooding back like a broken dam. "The white roses," he gasped. "In the garden at home. You were teaching me about art restoration when I was young. The studio in the East Wing." His voice broke as fragments of his past life clicked into place. Grace couldn't hold back any longer. She wrapped her arms around her son, and Peter, now increasingly remembering himself as Andrew, broke down in her embrace. "Mom," he sobbed, the word feeling both foreign and deeply familiar on his tongue. "I'm so sorry. I couldn't remember. I couldn't find my way home." The reunion drew tears from everyone present, including the usually composed Detective Rodriguez. Sarah held Hannah close as they witnessed the powerful moment. As Andrew's initial shock subsided, more memories began surfacing. "The party," he said suddenly. "Your 60th birthday. I was driving home. There were bright lights." "Shoo," Grace soothed, still holding him. "That's all behind us now. You're safe. You're found." Over the next hour, as medical professionals checked Andrew's condition, more family members arrived. His sister Catherine, his aunt Eleanor, all approaching carefully to avoid overwhelming him. Each face triggered new memories, pieces of his life slowly falling back into place. They gathered in a private room at a nearby hotel, where Andrew was given clean clothes and medical attention. Hannah and Sarah were invited to join them, honored guests in this intimate family reunion. "The art galleries," Andrew said, looking at his sister Catherine. "Paris, London. The Monet exhibition last spring." His face lit up with each recovered memory. "Yes," Catherine exclaimed. "You curated that entire show. It was brilliant, Andrew." As Andrew continued reconnecting with his family, Grace approached Hannah and Sarah. "I can never thank you enough," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We had almost lost hope of finding him." Hannah, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. He was never really lost, Mrs. Collins. He just needed someone to be his friend. Grace knelt down to Hannah's level, struck by the wisdom in the child's words. You know, Hannah, your kindness has taught us all something important. Our family has focused so much on art preservation, but we've perhaps forgotten about preserving humanity itself. A thoughtful look crossed Grace's face. Sarah, she turned to Hannah's mother, your daughter's compassion has changed our lives. Perhaps we could work together to help others in similar situations? What do you mean? Sarah asked. I'm thinking of establishing a foundation, Grace explained, her eyes bright with purpose. One that combines our resources with the kind of genuine compassion your daughter showed Andrew. We could help homeless individuals reconnect with their families, provide mental health support, offer second chances. The plot twist came as Grace continued, and I'd like you and Hannah to help lead it. Your perspective, Sarah, as a nurse, and Hannah's pure heart. They're exactly what this initiative needs. Sarah was stunned. Mrs. Collins, that's incredibly generous, but I wouldn't know the first thing about running a foundation. Please, Grace smiled. Call me Grace. And you know the most important thing, how to care. Everything else can be learned. From across the room, Andrew called out, Hannah. He walked over, looking more like his old self despite his still disheveled appearance. I remember something else. Every day, you would share your lunch with me, even though you didn't have much yourself. That kind of generosity, it kept me human when I'd forgotten who I was. Hannah beamed up at him. Does this mean we can still be friends, even though you're not Peter anymore? Andrew knelt beside his mother, facing Hannah. We'll always be friends. In fact, I think we could do much more together. Mother's right. We need to help others like you helped me. As the day progressed, plans for the foundation began taking shape. What had started with a simple shared sandwich was transforming into something much bigger, a movement that would touch countless lives. That evening, as Sarah and Hannah walked home, Hannah asked, Mama, do you think other people like Peter, Andrew, will find their families too? Sarah squeezed her daughter's hand. Thanks to you, baby, many of them will have a better chance now. You've shown us all that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the biggest changes. 2 weeks after Andrew's reunion with his family, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by papers and proposals. The Collins family had moved quickly, providing resources and support to establish what would become the Hannah Brown Foundation for Compassion. Sarah's fingers traced the foundation's newly designed logo, a simple sandwich divided in half, symbolizing the sharing that started it all. Are you sure about naming it after me, Mama? Hannah asked, peering over her mother's shoulder at the documents. Sarah smiled, pulling her daughter close. Baby, your simple act of kindness did what millions of dollars and dozens of investigators couldn't do. It brought a lost man home. That's worth honoring. The foundation's mission was taking shape, identifying and helping homeless individuals reconnect with their families, providing mental health support, and fostering community connections through simple acts of kindness. Grace Collins had already secured a small building near the park to serve as their headquarters. However, not everyone shared their enthusiasm. Did you hear? Mrs. Peterson's voice carried across the apartment complex's courtyard. Sarah Brown is letting that child of hers run some kind of homeless program. After everything that could have gone wrong with that man in the park. Similar whispers spread through their neighborhood. During a PTA meeting at Hannah's school, several parents confronted Sarah directly. Mrs. Brown, Linda Martinez, Tommy's mother, spoke up during the meeting. While we're all happy things worked out with Mr. Collins, don't you think you're sending the wrong message? Teaching children to approach strangers? Sarah stood tall, her nurse's uniform still on from her shift. What I'm teaching my daughter, and what this foundation will teach others, is responsible compassion. We're not encouraging children to approach strangers, we're creating safe ways for communities to help those in need. But using your 8-year-old daughter as the face of this program? Another parent chimed in. It seems exploitative. My daughter, Sarah's voice remained calm but firm, chose to show kindness when most adults would have walked by. The foundation bears her name because she reminded us all of our humanity. And every program we're developing includes proper safety protocols and professional oversight. Despite the criticism, Sarah pressed forward. The Collins family's support provided legitimacy, but it was the small victories that kept her motivated. Like when they helped Mr. Rodriguez, a homeless veteran, reconnect with his estranged daughter. Or when they established a safe space where people could share meals and stories, breaking down barriers between the housed and unhoused members of their community. One evening, as Sarah worked late at the foundation's office, an unexpected visitor arrived. It was Mrs. Peterson, the same neighbor who had been one of their vocal critics. "I saw what you did today," Mrs. Peterson said quietly, "with that young woman and her child." Earlier that day, the foundation had helped a teenage mother find temporary housing and enrolled her in a job training program. Sarah had personally ensured the young woman's 2-year-old had proper medical care. "I may have been hasty in my judgment," Mrs. Peterson continued, pulling out an envelope. "My late husband was like your Andrew Collins once. Lost, confused after Vietnam. Nobody helped him find his way back." Her voice cracked. "I'd like to volunteer, if you'll have me." This became the first of many such conversations. Critics began to see the careful planning behind each initiative, the professional protocols in place, and most importantly, the real impact on people's lives. The plot twist came during a community meeting where Sarah was defending the foundation's latest initiative, a program to provide medical checkups for homeless individuals. As she faced another round of criticism, Andrew Collins himself walked in, accompanied by his mother. "I understand your concerns," Andrew addressed the crowd. "A few months ago, I was the stranger you warned your children about. I was lost, not just physically, but in my mind." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "But it took a child's simple act of kindness to begin my journey home. What this foundation does isn't just about helping the homeless. It's about restoring dignity, rebuilding connections, and remembering our shared humanity." Grace stepped forward. "We're not asking children to approach strangers. We're asking adults to step up and create safe ways to help those in need." The Hannah Brown Foundation is about organized, responsible compassion. The room fell silent. Then Mrs. Peterson stood up. "I'd like to share something about my husband." As she told her story, others began sharing theirs, tales of family members who had struggled, of times when they themselves had needed help but found none. That evening, Sarah added several new volunteer applications to her files. The foundation's first community dinner was scheduled for the following week, and the medical clinic would open by month's end. As she drove home with Hannah, they passed Peter's old bench in the park. A small plaque had been installed there. "Kindness begins with a simple act of sharing." The Hannah Brown Foundation? "Mama," Hannah said thoughtfully, "remember when you said I shouldn't talk to strangers in the park?" "Yes, baby. Maybe sometimes people aren't really strangers. Maybe they're just friends we haven't helped yet." Sarah glanced at her daughter, marveling at her wisdom. The foundation might bear Hannah's name, but its true legacy would be in teaching others to see the world through her eyes, where every person, regardless of their circumstances, deserved a chance at connection and compassion. The gymnasium of Jefferson Elementary School buzzed with activity on a Saturday morning. Tables lined the walls, laden with fresh produce, non-perishable foods, and warm clothing. Sarah stood at the entrance, directing volunteers, while Hannah helped arrange donated books at a reading corner. "I never thought we'd see this many people," Grace Collins remarked, watching the diverse crowd of volunteers and community members interacting naturally. The sight of wealthy donors working alongside former critics like Mrs. Peterson, all wearing the foundation's signature purple aprons, brought a smile to her face. Andrew, now fully recovered and serving as the foundation's art therapy director, was teaching a group of children how to paint. Among them were both students from Hannah's class and children from the local shelter, their laughter bridging social divides that once seemed insurmountable. "Remember when Mrs. Martinez said this would never work?" Sarah whispered to Grace, watching Tommy Martinez's mother enthusiastically organizing the clothing distribution section. The same woman who had questioned them at the PDA meeting was now one of their most dedicated volunteers. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It began with small steps, weekly food distributions, after-school tutoring programs, and community dinners where people from all walks of life shared meals and stories. The foundation had become a bridge, connecting those who wanted to help with those who needed it. "Sarah," Mrs. Peterson called out urgently. Channel 7 News is here. Sarah turned to see a news van pulling up outside the gymnasium. A reporter and cameraman were already making their way inside, drawn by reports of the foundation's growing impact on the community. Mrs. Brown, the reporter, Jessica Chin, approached with her microphone. We've heard remarkable stories about how your foundation is transforming this neighborhood. Would you mind telling us how it all started? Before Sarah could respond, Hannah stepped forward. It started with a sandwich, she said simply, her voice clear and confident. Sometimes people just need to know somebody cares. The reporter knelt down to Hannah's level, intrigued. And you're the Hannah from the foundation's name? Yes, ma'am. I shared my lunch with Mr. Collins when he was lost, but I didn't know he was Mr. Collins then. He was just Peter, and he was hungry. The camera captured Hannah's genuine smile, Andrew's proud expression as he joined them, and the bustling activity of the gymnasium. The story aired that evening on the local news, but nobody was prepared for what happened next. The plot twist came in waves. First, the story was picked up by national news networks. Then, social media exploded with shares and comments. By Monday morning, the foundation's website had crashed from too many visitors. Sarah, Grace called excitedly, rushing into the foundation's office. You won't believe this. The video of Hannah talking about the sandwich has gone viral. We've received donation pledges from across the country. Sarah stared at her computer screen, overwhelmed by the flood of emails. Companies wanted to sponsor their programs. Schools from other states were asking how to start similar initiatives. Celebrities were sharing the story and offering support. But it was a different kind of message that caught Sarah's attention. Look at this, she said, voice trembling as she read an email. Dear Hannah Brown Foundation, I was homeless for 3 years after losing my job and family to addiction. Yesterday, a young girl offered me a sandwich at the park, saying she learned it from Hannah. For the first time in years, someone looked me in the eyes and saw a person, not a problem. I'm writing this from a library computer to ask how I can get help. I'm ready to find my way home too. The foundation's phone lines were ringing constantly. Local businesses that had initially kept their distance were now calling to offer partnerships. The mayor's office wanted to discuss expanding the program citywide. Mama, Hannah said, watching the flurry of activity. Remember when you said kindness ripples out like waves in a pond? I think we made a really big splash. Sarah hugged her daughter, remembering how it all started with one small act of compassion. We sure did, baby. We sure did. The gymnasium continued to serve as their main distribution center, but soon they needed more space. The Collins family offered additional buildings, and other property owners in the area followed suit. What began as a local food distribution program was evolving into a comprehensive community support network. One evening, as Sarah and Hannah walked home past Peter's bench in the park, they noticed something new. People had started leaving small offerings, sandwiches wrapped in paper, bottles of water, kind notes. An informal kindness exchange had sprouted organically, inspired by Hannah's story. Look, Mama, Hannah pointed to a new face on the bench. A young woman reading one of the notes left with a sandwich. She's smiling. Sarah watched as another passerby, without hesitation, sat down to talk with the woman. The culture of their community was changing, fear giving way to compassion, judgment transforming into understanding. That night, as Sarah updated the foundation's mission statement, she added a new line. Every sandwich shared is a story waiting to be told, a life waiting to be changed, and a community waiting to be transformed. The local news story had done more than bring attention to their cause. It had shown people everywhere that change doesn't require grand gestures or enormous resources. Sometimes, it starts with something as simple as sharing lunch with a stranger. What about the people who aren't homeless but are still lonely? Hannah asked one evening during a foundation board meeting. She had been quietly coloring in the corner while the adults discussed their latest initiatives, but her question brought the conversation to a halt. Sarah turned to her daughter. What do you mean, sweetheart? Like Mrs. Larson in apartment 4B. She sits by her window all day, and nobody visits her. Maybe she needs a friend too, just like Peter did. The simple observation led to the foundation's newest initiative, Friends Across Ages, a program designed to connect young volunteers with elderly community members. Sarah remembered how Hannah's friendship had helped Andrew find his way back to himself, and wondered if the same principle could work for their older neighbors who had become isolated. Within weeks, the program took shape. The foundation carefully screened and trained young volunteers, matching them with elderly participants for regular visits, shared activities, and companionship. Hannah, naturally, was paired with Mrs. Larson. "Are you sure you want to spend your Saturday afternoons with an old lady?" Mrs. Larson asked during their first official visit, her weathered hands trembling slightly as she poured tea into delicate china cups. "I like your stories," Hannah replied, carefully holding her teacup the way Mrs. Larson had taught her. "And you make the best cookies. Plus, you said you'd teach me how to knit." The walls of Mrs. Larson's apartment told their own story, faded photographs of a younger woman standing in front of art galleries, certificates from various museums, and carefully preserved newspaper clippings about art restoration projects. One Saturday, as Hannah helped Mrs. Larson organize her photo albums, she noticed something familiar. "Mama, look," she called to Sarah, who was dropping off some groceries. "That's Grace in this picture." Sarah moved closer, examining the yellowed photograph. Indeed, a younger Grace Collins stood beside Mrs. Larson in what appeared to be an art gallery opening. Mrs. Larson adjusted her glasses, peering at the photo. "Oh my, I haven't looked at these in years." "Yes, that's Grace Collins. I was the head conservator at the Collins Gallery for nearly 3 decades, before my arthritis forced me to retire." The plot twist unfolded as Mrs. Larson continued her story. "I actually trained Andrew, you know. He was such a talented young man, so passionate about art preservation. When I heard about his accident," her voice trailed off, eyes misting over. "You knew Andrew?" Hannah asked, amazed at the connection. "Knew him? My dear, I practically raised him in that gallery. His mother was so busy running the business, and Andrew would spend hours watching me restore paintings. He had such gentle hands, perfect for detailed work." Mrs. Larson smiled at the memory. "When I had to retire, he was the one who took over my position. But then I got sick, moved to this apartment, and lost touch with everyone." Sarah immediately called Grace, who was overjoyed to learn about Mrs. Larson's whereabouts. Within an hour, both Grace and Andrew arrived at the apartment, leading to an emotional reunion. "Eleanor Larson," Andrew exclaimed, memories flooding back. "The Madonna restoration project. You taught me how to mix the perfect pigments." Mrs. Larson's apartment soon became a hub of activity. Grace arranged for her to serve as a consultant for the gallery's education program, teaching art appreciation classes via video call to students in the foundation's after-school programs. Her expertise added a new dimension to Andrew's art therapy sessions. The success of Mrs. Larson's story inspired others. More elderly residents signed up for the companionship program, each bringing their own unique skills and histories to share. Mr. Chun, a retired mathematics professor, began tutoring students. Mrs. Rodriguez, who had worked as a seamstress for 40 years, started teaching sewing classes. The foundation's community center buzzed with intergenerational activity. Young volunteers learned life skills and history from their elderly companions, while the older participants found new purpose and connection. "It's like we're weaving a tapestry," Sarah explained during a community meeting. "Each person's story and skills become threads that strengthen the whole fabric of our community." Even former critics were won over. Mrs. Peterson, who had once questioned the foundation's methods, now coordinated the weekly stories and skills sessions where elderly participants shared their expertise with younger community members. One afternoon, as Hannah and Mrs. Larson worked on their knitting project, the elderly woman paused, looking thoughtfully at her young companion. "You know, dear," she said, "when I first moved here, I thought my story was over. I'd lost my career, my connections, my purpose. But you and this foundation, you've helped me write a new chapter." Hannah carefully counted her stitches before responding. "That's what Andrew needed too. Sometimes people just need help remembering who they are." Sarah, watching from the doorway, realized that their foundation had evolved into something far more profound than a homeless outreach program. It had become a web of connections, each relationship strengthening the others, each story enriching the whole. That evening, as they updated the Foundation's website, they added a new section. Every person has a story worth hearing, skills worth sharing, and wisdom worth preserving. Sometimes it just takes one connection to unlock a lifetime of possibilities. The Friends Across Ages program continued to grow, revealing countless hidden connections within their community. What started as Hannah's simple observation about loneliness had blossomed into a movement that proved that companionship, like kindness, had the power to transform lives at any age. The community center's main hall had been transformed. Long tables stretched end to end, dressed in autumn-colored linens, and decorated with handmade centerpieces crafted by children from the after-school program. The aroma of roasting turkeys, donated by local businesses and prepared by volunteer chefs, filled the air. Sarah stood at the entrance, checking her list one final time. 273 confirmed guests, she murmured, still amazed by the numbers. What had started as a simple idea for a community Thanksgiving dinner had grown into something much larger. Hannah darted between tables, placing handwritten name cards at each setting. She had insisted that everyone should have a proper place card, so nobody feels like a stranger. Each card featured a small drawing and a personal welcome message. "The buses are arriving," Mrs. Peterson called from her post at the window. The foundation had arranged transportation for elderly residents and families from local shelters, ensuring nobody would miss the celebration due to lack of transportation. As people began filing in, the magic of the evening became apparent. Mrs. Larson sat between a young single mother and a formerly homeless veteran, sharing stories about her days as an art conservator. Mr. Chen, the retired mathematics professor, was deep in conversation with a group of teenagers about their college aspirations. The barriers that typically divided their community seemed to dissolve around the shared tables. Andrew Collins, now fully recovered and dressed in a warm sweater that Mrs. Rodriguez had knitted for him, stood to address the gathering. The room fell silent. "A year ago," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I was lost. Not just physically, but in every way that matters. I had no memory of who I was, no connection to my past, and no hope for my future." He paused, looking around the room. "I was sitting on a park bench, hungry and alone, when an 8-year-old girl offered me half of her sandwich." All eyes turned to Hannah, who blushed and squeezed her mother's hand. "That simple act of kindness," Andrew continued, "didn't just feed my body, it fed my soul. It reminded me that I was human, that I mattered." Hannah didn't know who I was, but she saw me when others looked away. And that moment of connection became the first thread in weaving me back into the fabric of life. Grace Collins stood next to her son, dabbing at her eyes with a napkin. "We spent months searching for Andrew with private investigators, police departments, and missing persons networks. But it was a child's compassion that brought him home." The plot twist came as Grace stepped forward, unfolding a large presentation board. Which is why today, on this Thanksgiving, the Collins family would like to announce something special. She revealed architectural renderings of buildings in different cities. The Hannah Brown Foundation for Compassion is expanding. "We're opening new branches in 5 cities across the country." A murmur of excitement rippled through the room. Grace continued, "Each branch will follow the model we've created here: food distribution, companionship programs, art therapy, and most importantly, the spirit of connection that Hannah taught us all." Sarah gasped as Grace turned to her. "Sarah, we'd like you to oversee the expansion as our national program director. Your nursing background, organizational skills, and most importantly, your heart for this work make you the perfect person to lead this growth." Hannah tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Does this mean other kids will learn to share their sandwiches too?" The room erupted in warm laughter and applause. Andrew knelt beside Hannah's chair. "It means more than that. It means other communities will learn what yours already knows, that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can create the biggest changes." As the meal progressed, stories flowed as freely as the gravy. Mrs. Larson shared tales of Andrew's early days in art restoration. Former critics of the foundation admitted how wrong they'd been. New volunteers signed up for upcoming programs. Near the end of the evening, each guest received a small gift bag containing a sandwich cookie split in half, wrapped carefully with a note that read, "Share this half with someone new." You never know whose life you might change. Sarah watched as Hannah helped an elderly man find his name card at one of the tables. Her daughter had grown so much in the past year, not just in height but in understanding. The foundation bearing her name had become a testament to the power of simple human connection. As the evening wound down, Grace gathered everyone for a final announcement. Before we end this beautiful celebration, I want to share one more thing. Starting next year, November will be officially recognized in our city as Kindness Connection Month, with this community Thanksgiving dinner becoming an annual tradition. The room burst into applause again, but Hannah had one more question. Standing on her chair, with her mother's steadying hand, she addressed the crowd. Can we do this more than once a year? Because people need kindness every day, not just on Thanksgiving. Grace smiled. Out of the mouths of babes, she said softly. Hannah's right. While this dinner will be our grand celebration, our work continues every day. Because kindness, like the best family traditions, should be practiced year-round. As people began gathering their coats and saying goodbyes, Sarah noticed something remarkable. Nobody was leaving alone. People who had arrived as strangers were exchanging phone numbers, making plans to meet again, offering rides home to new friends. That night, as Sarah and Hannah walked home under a star-filled sky, they passed Peter's old bench in the park. Someone had left a fresh sandwich there, wrapped carefully with a note. Look, Mama, Hannah pointed. The kindness is spreading all by itself now. Sarah hugged her daughter close. That's because you showed us how, baby. You showed us all how. The bright studio lights felt warm on Sarah's face as she sat across from the morning show host, trying to remember all the media training Grace had given her. But when the host asked about Hannah's sandwich, the rehearsed answers fell away, replaced by a mother's genuine pride. My daughter taught me something profound that day, Sarah said, her voice clear and steady. She showed me that kindness doesn't need to be complicated. It just needs to be genuine. The interview was being broadcast live nationwide, part of a series on Americans Making a Difference. Behind the cameras, Hannah sat with Grace, both giving Sarah encouraging thumbs-up signals. And now, less than a year later, the Hannah Brown Foundation has become a movement, the host commented, holding up a tablet showing viral videos of sandwich sharing events happening across the country. How does it feel to see your daughter's simple act inspiring so many? Sarah smiled, thinking of the thousands of emails and letters they'd received. It's overwhelming, but in the best possible way. We're seeing people realize that they don't need wealth or special skills to make a difference. They just need to be willing to see others as human beings worthy of connection. The Foundation's office had to hire additional staff just to manage the influx of support. Letters arrived daily. Dear Hannah and Sarah, your story inspired our school to start a lunch-sharing program. Now no child eats alone. And we've seen friendships form across groups that never mixed before. Principal Martinez, Phoenix Elementary. To the Hannah Brown Foundation, I was skeptical about your approach until I saw my own daughter share her lunch with a new refugee student. They're best friends now, and both families have grown closer. Thank you for showing us that children sometimes make the best teachers. James Wilson, Minneapolis. The plot twist arrived on a regular Tuesday morning. Sarah was reviewing expansion plans with Grace when their financial director burst into the office, face flushed with excitement. You need to see this, she said, placing a document on the desk. An anonymous donor just transferred $50 million to the foundation's account. Sarah stared at the numbers, certain there was a mistake. Along with the transfer was a simple note. 20 years ago, someone shared their lunch with me when I was at my lowest. I built my company from that moment of kindness, promising myself I'd pay it forward someday. The Hannah Brown Foundation is doing what I've always dreamed of, making kindness systematic without losing its personal touch. Use this to build kindness centers in every city that needs one. A friend who once needed a sandwich. The donation transformed their expansion plans overnight. What had been a 5-city goal became a nationwide possibility. Sarah's role as National Program Director took on new significance as she began coordinating with city planners and local organizations across the country. But how do we keep it personal? Hannah asked during a family dinner, worried about the foundation growing too big. I don't want it to become just another big charity. Sarah pulled out her notebook. showing Hannah the plans she'd been developing. Each kindness center would follow what they now called the Hannah model, a welcoming space designed to feel like a home, programs that fostered personal connections, a commitment to treating everyone with dignity, and always a kitchen where people could share meals together. The media coverage continued to grow. Sarah found herself speaking at conferences, consulting with other organizations, and even testifying before Congress about community-based approaches to addressing homelessness and social isolation. But it was the small moments that kept her grounded, like when she visited their first expansion site in Detroit, where a local girl had already started sharing her lunch with elderly neighbors, or in Seattle, where a coffee shop owner had created a suspended sandwich program, allowing customers to prepay for meals that anyone could claim. One evening, as Sarah prepared for another day of meetings, Hannah came to her home office with a concerned look. "Mama," she said, "are you happy being on TV and traveling so much? It's different from being a nurse." Sarah pulled her daughter close. "Remember how you felt when you shared your sandwich with Peter? That feeling that you were doing exactly what you were supposed to do?" Hannah nodded. "That's how I feel now. Being a nurse taught me to care for people's bodies, but this foundation lets me help heal communities. And every time I share your story, it's like sharing hope with people who need it." The next morning, Sarah received an unexpected call from the anonymous donor. Though they wished to remain unnamed, they shared their story of being homeless after leaving an abusive relationship and how a stranger's kindness had given them the courage to start over. "Your daughter," the donor said, "is showing the world that kindness isn't just nice, it's necessary. It's a form of social medicine, as vital as any healthcare system." That evening, Sarah added a new section to the Foundation's training manual. Every kindness center is more than a building. It's a reminder that healing happens through connection, that hope spreads through simple acts of sharing, and that every person who walks through our doors has both something to receive and something to give. As she worked late into the night, finalizing plans for the next wave of kindness centers, Sarah glanced at the framed photo on her desk. Hannah sharing a sandwich with Peter on that park bench, neither of them knowing they were starting a movement that would touch thousands of lives. On her computer, the map of planned kindness centers glowed with dozens of points of light, each representing a community where someone else's child might learn to share their sandwich, where someone else's parent might find their way home, where kindness would become not just an action but a way of life. 1 year to the day after Hannah shared her sandwich with Peter, Sarah stood at the window of her new office, overlooking the park where it all began. The old bench was still there, but it had been transformed. Now it sat in the center of what the community called Kindness Garden, surrounded by blooming flowers and bearing a small plaque that read, "Where a sandwich changed everything." Hannah, now 9, sat at her own small desk in the corner of Sarah's office, working on thank you cards for donors. She had insisted on personally drawing on each one, saying, "People need to know we see them, just like I saw Peter." Sarah picked up the morning's newspaper, smiling at the headline, "Kindness Centers Transform Communities. The Hannah Brown Foundation opens its 20th location." Below was a photo of Hannah cutting the ribbon at their latest center in Chicago, standing between Sarah and Andrew Collins. "Mama," Hannah called out, "remember when you were worried about quitting your nursing job?" Sarah nodded, thinking back to those early uncertain days. "I was scared of making such a big change. But sometimes the scariest decisions lead us exactly where we're meant to be." The foundation had evolved beyond anything they could have imagined. Each kindness center had become a hub of community transformation, offering not just material support but something far more valuable, a sense of belonging. The Friends Across Ages program had expanded nationwide, connecting thousands of young volunteers with elderly companions. Art therapy sessions, led by Andrew, helped people process trauma and rediscover their voices. Sarah's desk was covered with letters from people whose lives had been touched by the foundation. "Dear Sarah and Hannah, today I shared my lunch with someone who looked lonely, just like Hannah did. It turned out she was a new student from Syria. Now she's teaching me Arabic, and I'm teaching her English. Thank you for showing me that friendship can start with something as simple as sharing. Emma, age 10". To the Hannah Brown Foundation, I was one of the skeptics who opposed your first kindness center in our neighborhood. Today, I volunteer there 3 times a week. Watching my community transform has transformed me too. Thank you for not giving up on us. Former Councilman Robert Chun. The foundation's impact had rippled out in unexpected ways. Schools across the country had adopted kindness curriculum programs based on Hannah's story. Businesses were implementing compassion initiatives inspired by their work. Even healthcare facilities were studying their model of community-based healing. As Sarah reviewed the day's schedule, her phone buzzed with a message from Grace Collins. The anonymous donor who had funded their expansion had finally agreed to meet them in person. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she read the next line. It was someone they already knew. Mrs. Larson walked into the office, leaning on her cane but standing prouder than Sarah had ever seen her. I think it's time I told you the whole story, she said, settling into a chair. She explained how she had invested her art restoration earnings wisely over the decades, building a fortune she'd never needed. When I saw what you and Hannah were doing, she said, her eyes misting, I knew I'd found the perfect way to use it. You've restored something far more precious than art. You've restored faith in human kindness. Hannah hugged Mrs. Larson tightly. So you're our sandwich angel. We all need angels sometimes, dear, Mrs. Larson replied. Sometimes they come disguised as little girls with peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. That evening, Sarah and Hannah walked through their newest project, a community garden being planted behind the original Kindness Center. Each plant had been chosen and planted by a different community member, creating a living tapestry of their shared story. Look, Mama, Hannah pointed to a young apple tree. Mr. Chun says it'll grow fruit that everyone can share. Sarah watched as the setting sun painted the garden in warm golden light. Around them, volunteers were finishing their day's work, chatting and laughing together. Wealthy donors working alongside former homeless individuals, elderly gardeners teaching children about plants, recent immigrants sharing gardening techniques from their home countries. You know what I've learned this year? Sarah said, sitting with Hannah on a garden bench. Kindness isn't just about giving. It's about creating spaces where people can both give and receive, where everyone's dignity is honored, where strangers can become family. Hannah nodded wisely. Like how Peter became Andrew again, and Mrs. Larson became our sandwich angel, and how everyone who comes to our centers becomes part of our story. Sarah pulled out her notebook. She still carried one everywhere, and wrote down Hannah's words. They would become part of the Foundation's new mission statement. Every act of kindness creates a story. Every story creates a connection. Every connection changes a life. As they walked home in the twilight, they passed dozens of people they now knew by name. The neighborhood that had once felt fragmented had become a true community. Children played freely in the parks, elderly residents sat on their porches greeting passers-by, and at the corner store, a sign read, "Need a sandwich? Take one. Have extra? Leave one." "Mama," Hannah said as they reached their front door, "do you think we'll ever run out of ways to be kind?" Sarah thought about the thousands of kindness centers yet to be built, the countless connections yet to be made, the infinite possibilities that lay in simple acts of human compassion. "No, sweetheart," she replied, "I think we're just getting started." And she was right, because kindness, like the seeds in their new garden, only needs a small space to take root. But once it grows, it spreads on its own, creating a harvest of hope that feeds generations to come.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.